You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 28th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio.
How to lose a debate to an elderly, incoherent and unhinged convicted criminal. Barcelona attempts to deter the riffraff, and a leaf through Monocle's new quality of life issue naming Earth's 20 nicest cities. There's always next year, Minsk. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. It's Friday, so it's our weekly in-house daily, and the Monocle staffers who were persuaded that appearing on the number 3 daily news podcast in Lithuania, True Story, would represent some sort of career pinnacle are Chris Cermak, Thomas Lewis, Alexis Self and George Ruskin. They'll discuss the day's stuff, and we'll hear from the food writer Caroline Eden about her new book, Cold Kitchen. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and we will start with last night's first candidates debate of the 2024 US presidential election, held unusually early in the campaign, so early that neither man is yet his party's confirmed nominee, a fact which may become significant. For former President Donald Trump, though he was, as usual, incoherent, obnoxious and untethered to verifiable reality, his voters appear to regard these as virtues, and so it probably won't have done him much harm. For President Joe Biden, on the other hand, faced with a low bar, he rather tripped over it.
We'd be able to wipe out his debt. We'd be able to help make sure that all those things we need to do, child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our health care system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Well, listening to that with somewhat anguished expressions were Chris Cermak, Monocle Radio's senior news editor, and Thomas Lewis, Monocle's Toronto correspondent. Chris, first of all, I appreciate there may not be a short answer to this question, but how bad was it for the president?
I mean, you set it up exactly the way that it should be set up, in the sense that it is bad because there are expectations, right? Donald Trump also did not exactly perform well in this debate, but we know what Donald Trump is like. We have come to expect everything from Donald Trump that he delivered in that debate for the last almost a decade now, incredibly, when you think about it. So, yes, everything was baked in when it came to Donald Trump. Joe Biden, it was bad. I mean, it just was. And I think what's quite striking about all of this is simply the fact that it took until this moment for Democrats to suddenly kind of pull the emergency brake and start having this discussion about whether Joe Biden is the appropriate candidate or not. This has been something that Democrats until now have always said is a media construct, this idea that Joe Biden is not necessarily fit to serve another term, especially. You can, let alone the question of whether he is fit to serve at the moment. If sort of a la Ronald Reagan, he were ending his term, that would be one thing. But the fact is, this is a debate for him to run for another 4 years. And yes, the way that he performed in this debate, simply the halting nature of it, the pauses, the reactions, the looks on his face at various moments as well while Donald Trump was speaking, it's going to do him a pretty large amount of damage, I think.
Thomas, I'll bring you in. How did this land where you are? Is everybody in Toronto panic buying tinned food and sandbags?
Well, I haven't been to the supermarket yet today, Andrew, so I'll check back on that a little bit later. But I was watching it here in Canada with some Canadian friends, and we were watching between the sort of fingers, her hands clasped over her eyes, really, kind of couldn't quite believe how things were unfolding. And it did remind me, I think we probably had a conversation at the time 4 years ago, that first debate in 2020, when it was sort of the reverse of what took place last night. Donald Trump very aggressive, talking over everyone, and that didn't play very well for him. For Joe Biden, obviously had been coached pretty extensively and had, played a big part in getting the format of the debate, as it was last night. Microphones cut when one person wasn't speaking, very contained 2-minute slots to speak. But the format just didn't work at all, really, for him. It seemed as though he was sort of getting slightly lost in the weeds, really, of kind of what he'd obviously, rehearsed and practiced that he'd like to say. And it got to a point where you had Donald Trump, who was using those contained moments to spew lots of untruths, where the CNN anchors, the moderators didn't really have the capacity, it seemed, to push back on those or to question him further on those. And then when Joe Biden was trying to sort of come back, he couldn't really assemble a sentence together. So the big points that he had to land just didn't really felt they land because of his delivery of them. So yes, that was sort of the mood in this one household in Canada, Andrew, last night.
Chris, it's not unusual for a presidential campaign to panic or have a bit of a flap or wonder if it's doing the right thing. I am reminded, and I checked and went back and looked it up, and I grant it was a different time and a different situation. In 1992, Bill Clinton was polling at 25% at this point in the campaign, running third, in fact, behind George W. Bush and Ross Perot. And there was talk of replacing this young upstart from Arkansas. But that's the thing. Clinton was a young upstart, and Biden is clearly a man at the end of his career, not at the beginning. So to you, how serious does the talk sound about replacing him? Because the difficulties, as I understand it, are one, that Biden has to decide to go. And then that prompts the question of, well, if he's going to go, does he go now? Which makes Vice President Harris the president, and therefore you would think the presumptive nominee, except her numbers when tested against Trump's are horrible, like worse than Biden's, although this, of course, has not been done with the assumption that she's either the president or the nominee. Or this gets thrown to an open convention, which would be, well, fascinating, but not actually what a party wants to project.
Well, it's obviously not what a party wants to project, but the question at the same time is, how happy are you with the current situation? I mean, at this point, when you talk about what you want to project, well, that really is the question. Are they willing to stand behind Joe Biden at this point or not? I think to your point about how this would go, yes, it has to start with Joe Biden himself. I think it's fair to say, particularly given that this was about a debate and not necessarily about his entire sort of acumen and whether he is fit for the job, given that he also has people around him to make decisions. I don't think there's necessarily a question now that he has to resign as president. It would simply be the question of whether he says, I am no longer going to be the nominee for another term. I have decided that one term is enough. At which point, yes, Kamala Harris would be the obvious person to then go into some kind of open convention and rally around despite the lack of popularity, or it opens up a whole can of worms for lots of different candidates to come in. There are plenty of them that would be willing to join the fray if Joe Biden had not decided that he was going to run for a second term. Gretchen Whitmer, Pete Buttigieg, Josh Shapiro from Virginia as well, Raphael Warnock from Georgia. I mean, there are a lot of candidates that are quite good that exist in the Democratic Party. Gavin Newsom of California. They could all decide, well, we're going to go into this open convention and see whether we can get support.
Thomas, while we have you here from Toronto, I think things are not as drastic for the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau as they may be for President Joe Biden, but Trudeau is not having a good week.
He's not having a good week. No, there have been suggestions for probably about a year now, Andrew, if you look at the opinion polls, that were a general election held here in Canada, which isn't scheduled until next autumn, I believe. At the very latest, it needs to be held. That Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, his Liberal Party, would suffer quite a handy defeat by the Conservative Party. Now, the constituency, the riding as they call it here in Canada, that I I'm in actually at the moment, had a by-election this week. And for the first time in decades, the Conservatives won that, albeit very narrowly, but it's been quite remarkable, the level of the discussion in the press here in Canada, really putting that defeat entirely on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's plate. Big questions about whether he should remain as the leader of the Liberal Party going into the next election, whether there's enough time here for a new leader to really make a name for themselves, to be able to contest a general election in a meaningful and competitive way. So it has felt for some time that Prime Minister Trudeau, for many voters, just can't do anything right, really, no matter what he does, and a whole array of policy points. But I think for many people, lots of insiders too, we've heard quoted in the press this week, feel that perhaps that this might be something of a turning point in terms of the sharpening of the questions about Prime Minister Trudeau's place as the head of his party, and indeed, when the time comes, the head of the country as well.
And Chris, just finally, returning to the United States, we should talk about some developments today. The Supreme Court has been having a bit of a think about things again.
It has, as it usually does around this time of year. It issues a bunch of rulings that it's been thinking about for the last 6 months or so. And there were some big ones today. One is that the Supreme Court has struck down the federal prosecutor's use of obstruction charges for hundreds of rioters on January 6th, 2021. It is not entirely clear what that means in terms of whether they can go free or not, or whether prosecutors would look for some other charges. But this was basically the big charge that was used, and was kind of an obscure charge about disrupting a federal proceeding that was used by prosecutors. The Supreme Court says that one went too far. So that's one to look out for. And then another one just on the way that the government is run in the U.S. Federal regulators for a long time basically have had the right to interpret the laws of Congress as they see fit. Particularly on climate change. You've seen this, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, much of its laws around greenhouse gases and so on are kind of reinterpreting congressional laws. The Supreme Court struck that down too. It's a 40-year-old precedent that had been set, Chevron versus the National Resources Defense Council, basically giving federal regulators leeway. That was struck down as well, and basically means that now every decision by federal regulators, or many of them, could end up before courts challenged, saying this went too far, this isn't what Congress intended, and so forth. Also, just very quickly to say, look out for Monday. That's when the Supreme Court is likely to decide whether Donald Trump has immunity for his own role on January 6th.
Chris Chermak and Thomas Lewis, thank you both for joining us. This is The Daily on Monocle Radio with me, Andrew Muller, and on better newsstands near you now is the new July-August summer double issue of Monocle magazine. It's our quality of life issue, which contains pointed suggestions on where you could be living a better life and how you could be living it longer. I'm joined with more on this by Alexis Self, Monocle's foreign editor. Lex, welcome to The Daily. And before we get into Monocle's always hotly anticipated quality of life survey, which lists the 20 most livable cities on Earth. I want to start by talking about not so much where to live your life as how to live your life so you get to live more of it. And you recently journeyed into the heart of darkness where this is concerned.
Well, there wasn't much darkness because as soon as anyone opened their mouths, their gleaming teeth lit up the stage.
Where and what was this?
I was at the second Med Longevity Summit in Lisbon, which is rather misleadingly, as I say in the piece, its slogan is dedicated to global wellness. Wellness is one of these 21st century words that...
It is, as you correctly note in the piece, an incredibly annoying word.
It doesn't mean anything.
It does not.
But the summit was convened, or has been convened, to discuss different ways to prolong one's life medically, but also I think we're learning, and certainly I learned a lot while I was there, away from the wellness word and these kind of newfangled technologies and techniques. I think at its core it was exploring ways in which science and philosophy and all these other things have converged to make us understand a bit more about not only how to live a longer life, but how to live a more meaningful life. It's interesting I thought that we understand Western medicine and science have expanded our understanding of how the human body works and what is good and bad for it. And that's kind of fused with sort of maybe more Eastern ideas about spirituality and emotional well-being and fulfillment to combine, I think, to create this movement, or at least that's my impression of it, the longevity movement, which is dedicated to those things.
I mean, genuine question though, did you come away from it with anything that you thought was actually useful in your own life, something you hadn't heard of or hadn't thought of?
Well, once you get past all of these incredibly jargon-filled titles of talks on dentistry and sexual health and, dermatological health, I think most of it actually boils down to stuff that, old wives...
Well, this is what I wonder. Does it always not just end up boiling down to try not to drink too much, don't eat too much crap, and maybe take a walk every so often?
All of that is good. Exercise regularly, but not too regularly. Eat well. Stuff like that. But then again, what we're understanding, given human physiology, is that the mind is so important, and so important to physical health is mental health. And so, I think contentment and fulfillment are two incredibly useful things for prolonging your life and making it a good life to prolong. That said, it's funny. It's always the kind of mean old 110-year-old that endures in popular imagination, But I don't know, that's probably mostly a misnomer anyway. And if you look at countries, and obviously that's a big part of what we do at Monocle, is looking at cultures that we admire and kind of giving people a lens into different places around the world. And if you look at countries that we admire, and cover quite a lot, places like Japan and Mediterranean countries like Spain and Italy and Greece, these are places where life expectancies are high. And, some of that is to do with the climate and the diet, but I think a lot of that is also to do with the fact that these are places where people still often live in tighter-knit communities, and there is still this idea that life isn't just about the kind of pursuit of material success, and it's about something that's a bit deeper than that, which, as we are seeing, has a very positive effect on one's longevity. Well,
let's pivot seamlessly from countries to cities, and that list of the 20 cities which, in Monocle's view, offer the best quality of life. This isn't necessarily a spoiler. There is tons more to read in the magazine, but it is a returned top spot for a bit of an old favourite.
Yes, this isn't a spoiler at all, because as I'm sure most listeners know by now, Munich has taken the top spot, the Bavarian capital. As ever, we look at a combination of data points. Sorry to say that word, data points. I don't think I've ever said it before. But
how are you enjoying it?
Yeah.
Do you think you'll use it again in conversation?
Only when I'm trying to back up a point that I haven't yet made. We look at metrics that range from the kind of more hard economic data, stuff like GDP per capita, average wage, average rental prices, and then softer stuff. How many museums are there? How many alfresco restaurants? How many Starbucks chains? And we're looking at lower is obviously better in that regard. And through a combination of these two things, the kind of hard, if you will, and the soft, we come up with the final ranking. And this year, Munich edged it, because it's blessed with certain kind of geographical benefits. It's near the Alps. It's got lots of green space, but it also has a proactive government and a city government that seems interested in improving the lives of every one of its citizens and kind of taking a proactive role in that.
I mean, we were discussing this, by which I mean remorselessly plugging this issue of the magazine on the Daily yesterday, and I was saying I've only really got to know Munich the last couple of years attending the Munich Security Conference for the Foreign Desk, and even in that slightly bizarre circumstance, just going out and about in Munich in the off hours, I have just found myself thinking, this just seems really nice. And I don't mean that in a kind of patronising way. I came back from the most recent trip to Munich just actually kind of angry with London, which I realise is a very different city. But there's just so much in Munich that you just find yourself thinking, why isn't basically everywhere like this?
Yeah, look, it's a very nice place, as are the rest of the top 5 in which to live. At the same time, London, New York, cities like that, Hong Kong, which are much bigger and have problems and issues that come along with being much bigger and having 10 times more people within their limits and under their jurisdiction. But we're interested in both. That's why it's a ranking. That's why we explore different subjects. And outside of the ranking, you will find us talking to mayors from cities that aren't in there and probably wouldn't be even in a top 50, but who are doing things that are interesting. And the reason that we publish this ranking and have done in the 17-year history of Monocle is that our readers are primarily people who live in cities and people who are interested in cities and believe cities to be the kind of primary, engines of advances and developments in, business, culture, design, stuff like that. And we believe it's important to look at what makes a city rankable and livable in that regard. But that doesn't mean that we're not interested in, for example, cities in North America, which didn't feature in this year's ranking, or cities in South America, which have a very, probably a worse reputation when it comes to quality of life, but have, great vibrancy in other areas. And we looked at 3 cities that are kind of bucking the trend when it comes to high crime and other kind of negative stories that you hear coming out of South American cities. So, if you're a city lover and you're interested in what makes these places distinct, and what makes them move and why they're interesting places to visit, to kind of talk about, to look at, because obviously we sumptuously illustrate all of this with amazing photography, then Monocle is the magazine for you, and especially the quality of life issue.
Like Self, thank you. You're listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio with me, Andrew Muller. Now, tourists in tourist destinations do no end of mystifying stuff, mostly to do with going to see the same things everybody else does and then taking photographs of them to show people who have probably already seen them. Even weirder than that, however, is what tourists in tourist destinations buy, in particular the genre of puerile tat, which is, give or take the name of the city on the t-shirt, tea towel or snow globe, pretty much the same from New York to Paris to Jerusalem to Sydney. However, one heavily visited city has wearied of it. Barcelona plans to restrict the sale of souvenirs decreed in bad taste. I'm joined with more on this by Monocle researcher George Ruskin. And George, first of all, to establish your interest in this idea, you are from Eastbourne, and you'd probably better explain Eastbourne as a concept to our international audience so they understand that when you speak of souvenir tat, you speak of what you know.
Absolutely. I'm speaking from the heart here. Eastbourne is a small seaside resort in the south of England, and it is a mecca of tat, I would say. It's mugs, it's T-shirts, it's fridge magnets of a variety of taste levels. And Eastbourne doesn't yet have one of these bans. And speaking from the heart here as someone who is raised surrounded by tat, this legislation does concern me somewhat.
So you're against this. Do you think Barcelona's being a bit high and mighty here?
I think so. And I think Barcelona does have a long track record of wanting to be at the forefront of this global trend to curb over-tourism. We've seen announcements this week. They're planning to ban short-term rent properties by 2030, and they're now tackling the tourist tat. And I think they're going to get themselves into quite a lot of difficulty, because any government that tries to legalise taste often finds itself very quickly in hot water. And I think it's a problem they don't want to have at the start of a busy summer season where millions are expected to flock to the city in the next couple of months.
Because you're right, this is the problem, or it's a problem. And I do speak as the kind of unreconstructed snob whose heart does somewhat sink upon walking past those stalls of witless T-shirts in Covent Garden, just thinking, like, nobody can possibly find any of this funny or amusing. Why is any of it here? Wouldn't this be just a nicer city if this was all pushed into a skip? But obviously, as you say, once you legislate this, somebody somewhere has to make this decision, and they have to apply criteria. Has Barcelona said who that lucky functionary is going to be or how they're going to do it?
This is one of the many things that they've not been clear about in the City Council announcement that's come this week, tackling these offensive souvenirs. There's been no announcement of a commissioner of taste of tats or whatever they want to call it. And
So
there's been
I'd quite fancy that job.
Yeah, it'd be great. I'm sure it's very well paid. And there's also not been an announcement of a tat task force, if you will. So it's unclear whether it's going to fall under the jurisdiction of the council or the police in Barcelona, the Guardia Civil. And there's also been no clarification on fines or potential license revoking if these businesses are found to have crossed the line in the sand, as it were.
So it does sound like this might be one of those things which ultimately, and it happens a lot with eye-catching political ideas, that once they are applied to reality, they tend to wither. Do you think Barcelona is actually going to get this up to the gate? Because in what you've laid out there, you have enumerated what is going to be one of the presentational difficulties of putting some, hapless T-shirt seller in court.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult for sure. I think my sense is that they will try and push through some sort of enforcement of this, just to, again, stay in the headlines and be at the forefront of this policy. But I am reminded of a recent policy announcement elsewhere in Spain, in Malaga, that again strikes me as quite hard and unpleasant to enforce. They announced this week that anyone caught urinating in the sea would face a fine of €750, which again strikes me as an enforcement they probably don't want to find themselves
urinating in the sea. Yeah, that does present policing challenges.
It does, for sure.
That I can see. But both of those, and I think just to bring this all together, along with other similar ordinances of the sort you mentioned, placing some restraints on tourism, and Barcelona, which has a fairly high opinion of itself, and not without reason. It's a lovely city, but what's really going on here is they're making a kind of statement about the sort of people we want to come here.
Absolutely. I think at the end of the day, it's all about taste and what they consider to be tourism in good taste and what they consider to be cheap, tacky tourism. They do have form for this. They back in 2018, they set up these so-called protected zones around the city where no tourist souvenir shops were allowed to exist at all. And as part of this week's announcement, those protected zones are going to be expanded to keep those streets, as they would see it, clean and clear of tacky tourist traps. So I think there's definitely an agenda here. I think there's a desire to have a bit of headline grabbing legislation that they can send out as a message of the sort of people they want to attract as tourists going forwards.
And those people who feel now rejected / slighted by Barcelona, would you enjoin them to Eastbourne?
Come to Eastbourne. We will support the tackiest, most gaudy of tourist traps. And if you want the sun, there's always Benidorm just down the coast. You'll be more than welcome there, I'm sure, with your tourist hat.
George Ruskin, thank you.
Thanks.
You are listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio, and finally on today's show, the food writer Caroline Eden has long perceived her travels through a culinary lens. When she moved to Edinburgh from her long-term home of South London, the change left her longing for the soothing experiences of eating and drinking in lands further off. Caroline's memoir, Cold Kitchen, celebrates how food can take anyone back to the places they once loved to visit, as well as cherishing the importance of curiosity and the feeling of being at home. Monocle's Chiara Ramella sat down with Caroline here in the studio to learn more. Chiara started by asking Caroline how a kitchen can become a portal to somewhere else.
I can only talk about my kitchen, obviously, and the sort of Airbnb kitchens that I stay in when I travel sometimes. But my kitchen is a portal to other places, other lives, other times, other people. So I believe that when I'm cooking a dish, or even if I'm just handling certain ingredients, it's a way for me to travel back in time or to other lands. And I don't think I'm alone in this. I think lots of people do the same.
The places that you do travel to in the book are primarily, I would say, kind of Central Asia, Caucasus, Russia, Eastern Europe, Baltics. What attracts you to these places? And what attracts you to their cuisine specifically?
So my writing career started in Central Asia. The first ever piece I had published was sent in from an internet cafe in Samarkand in 2009. So I believe in returning to places, to not spreading yourself too thinly. So I have this geographical reach in all of my books, which covers roughly from Eastern Europe to Central Asia. And I like returning, seeing what's changing over the years and digging in more rather than spreading myself too thinly. So I would never, for example, write about Peru or Australia, as wonderful as these places are. I'd rather just go there on holiday and write about the places I return to.
And what about the cuisine of these places? What really has stuck with your heart from these places? And do you think there's a red thread in between the dishes that you do end up picking and actually talking about quite specifically in the book?
I love the way you've used the phrase red thread, because this question gets asked to me fairly regularly. And we have to be very careful now when we use terms like post-Soviet space or, talk about the fall of the Soviet Union. But these countries do share cuisines partly because they were once part of this big grouping of countries. And so you find borscht in most countries, you find some form of dumplings, the breads have got similarities. And so what I really like to do is when I cross the border, see what's changed with the food and what stayed the same and what similarities I can find. And the other thing, really where it started, was that Central Asian food, people were very rude about it when I started out in 2009. People said, Western travel writers in their guidebooks and travel features, the few that would get published, everybody said, the food's not very good. You'll go hungry if you don't eat very much meat. It's very bland. And that just wasn't my experience. So I wanted to write a book many years ago, Samarkand, my first book, to right that wrong, really, and to show people that the markets are fantastic. And if you eat in people's homes, you eat really well. It's just the tourism infrastructure wasn't there. So people would parachute in and then they'd be like, well, there's a couple of shashlik restaurants, but there's not very much else. So I've been on this sort of journey from then, writing about this wonderful region. And I just love the flavours. I love the dairy and the herbs and the way that rice is used in different ways. I just think it's still quite an underrepresented part of the world.
Do you think it's possible to do travel writing without food writing?
Not for me. I used to work in a bookshop for many years in London, and I sort of ran the non-fiction floor. And I'd flick through these travel books at the counter, and I'd always notice food took up such a large piece, generally, not with everybody, within the pages. So people go to markets. Markets are a great way in, easy way in. You go to a market, you see what's for sale, what people are buying for the day. And I think, it's difficult to avoid it.
And what are your favourite travel writers, or what kind of travel writing and food writing has informed your bank of influences before you decided to take this route yourself?
So this is my fourth book, and in the last side I did Samarkand, Black Sea, Red Sands, which is all about Central Asia, and then this one, Cold Kitchen. And in each of those books I've brought in other writers because I'm a big reader and I love reading everything from literature, travel writing, poetry, and I like to try and bring people in who perhaps aren't so well known. So I love Carla Grisman, who I was talking about last night at the British Library. She wrote a book called Dinner of Herbs, all about Anatolia in the 1960s. I love Sybil Bedford. she wouldn't have called herself a food writer, but she wrote very evocatively about food, about being on the road. You know, she talks about being on a train and opening a bottle of wine with a zigzag corkscrew. And just, you can paint such wonderful images with food, and you can go off in such amazing tangents. You can talk about anything. I'm a great believer that you can talk about anything through the lens of food. So that's why I like to use it.
How do you think writing about food is different to writing about anything else? When you approach the task as a journalist and as a writer who's written for quite some time now, do you think that when you approach the task of writing about food, you approach it in a different way to any other subject?
I think I approached it, so I've written about other things as well, not just food, although I'm sort of, write about food mainly. I approach it in the same way. So often, one of the best things to do is just to sit down and have lunch with somebody. So in my Red Sands book, I sat down with a former curator of the Savitsky Museum, which is this wonderful collection of art in Karakorum, Pakistan and Uzbekistan. And I sat down with the former curator and we just shared a lunch in Tashkent. And so I interviewed her over lunch. And I just think it's as simple as that. And I would do that whether I was interviewing an engineer or a botanist. It's sharing a food, relaxing, the person you're interviewing, sharing a cup of tea. And I think I think that's the way to do it.
I know that it's always impossible to pinpoint just a specific dish or a specific memory. And because this whole book is an entire collection of memories, but if you had to point us to a specific recipe that you do include at the end of one of your chapters in this, is there one that really, really speaks to your heart? And which one would it be?
I think it would have to be the duck and barberry plov that's at the end of the chapter, all about a coup I was caught up in Bishkek. I was really taken under the wing by a couple of women there who, one was my Russian teacher and one was a young girl. I say girl, she was about 22. We sort of banded together during this very hard time when all the shops shut and there was huge political upheaval and very violent protests out on the street. And Maya, my young friend, gave me a box of pastries the morning after the terrible violence that had happened. And Jarkin, my Russian teacher, had taken me out to her dacha to meet her family. Somebody cooked this wonderful duck and barberry plov outside in what's called a kazan, which is like a giant cooking vessel. And that was wonderful. So I've included a recipe for that. And it's also because I've eaten so much plov, similar to a pilaf, over the years in Central Asia, and they're all different ingredients in each one.
Why include actual recipes in it? Because it is such a literary book, where was the impulse to actually make it fairly practical at the end of the day as well?
I like the idea of making... they're sort of travel logs with recipes, these books that I write, and I think of it as a sort of another way to share the journey. I talk about the recipes being like postcards. So obviously I'm not from these places. They're not strictly authentic at all. They're my interpretation. So they're a bit like me sending a postcard to the reader and showing another way for someone to sort of taste the journey. And people make the recipes, which I always find, I love this so much because I'm just a home-taught cook. But I think people like that. They like the extra layer that's offered. And I did think about not including recipes in this book, but I just thought, why wouldn't I do that? I can include one at the end. And of course that works because I'm making the dish through the chapter and then we sort of teleport in and out of the subterranean kitchen and come back. So I kind of felt I would have cheated the reader not to include the recipe at the end.
That was Caroline Eden speaking to Chiara Romella. Caroline's book, Cold Kitchen, is out now. That's all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our guests today. Today's show was produced by Henry Rhys Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Gronlid. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time on Monday. Thanks for listening and have a great weekend.